for more than 160 years. The one subject that has appeared most frequently on the face of United States postage stamps is that of American presidents. When the U.S. Post Office released its first two postage stamps in 1847, George Washington, along with Benjamin Franklin, were the two subjects depicted on these premiere issues. The advent of presidents on postage stamps has been definitive to U.S. postage stamp design since the first issues were released and set the precedent that U.S. stamp designs would follow for many generations. The paper postage stamp itself was born of utility, as something simple and easy to use was needed to confirm that postage had been paid for an item of mail. People could purchase several stamps at one time and no longer had to make a special trip to pay for postage each time an item was mailed. The postage stamp design was usually printed from a fine engraving and were almost impossible to forge adequately. This is where the appearance of presidents on stamps was introduced. Moreover, the subject theme of a president, along with the honors associated with it, is what began to define the stamp issues in ways that took it beyond the physical postage stamp itself, and is why people began to collect them. There exist entire series of stamp issues whose printing was inspired by the subject alone. The portrayals of Washington and Franklin on U.S. postage are among the most definitive of examples and have appeared on numerous postage stamps. The presidential theme in stamp designs would continue as the decades passed, each period issuing stamps with variations of the same basic presidential portrait design theme. The portrayals of U.S. presidents on U.S. postage has remained a significant subject and design theme on definitive postage throughout most of U.S. stamp issuance history. Engraved portrayals of U.S. presidents were the only designs found on U.S. postage from 1847 until 1869, with the one exception of Benjamin Franklin, whose historical stature was comparable to that of a president. During this period, the U.S. Post Office issued various postage stamps bearing the depictions of George Washington foremost, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln, the last of whom first appeared in until 1866, 1 year after his death. After 22 years of issuing stamps with only presidents and Franklin, the Post Office in 1869 issued a series of 11 postage stamps that were generally regarded by the American public as being abruptly different from the previous issues and whose designs were considered at the time to be a break from the tradition of honoring American forefathers on the nation's postage stamps. These new issues had other non-presidential subjects and a design style that was also different, one issue bearing a horse, another a locomotive, while others were depicted with non-presidential themes. Washington and Lincoln were to be found only once in this series of 11 stamps, which some consider to be below par in design and image quality. As a result, this pictographic series was met with general disdain and proved so unpopular that the issues were consequently sold for only 1 year, where remaining stocks were pulled from post offices across the United States. In 1870, the Post Office resumed its tradition of printing postage stamps with the portraits of American presidents and Franklin, but now added several other famous Americans, including Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Alexander Hamilton, and General Winfield Scott, among other notable Americans. Indeed, the balance had now shifted somewhat. Of the 10 stamps issued in 1870, only 4 offered presidential images. Moreover, presidents also also appeared on less than half of the denominations in the definitive sets of 1890, 1917, 1954 and 1965, while occupying only a slight majority of values in the definitive issues of 1894 to 98, 1902 and 1922 to 25. Presidential images did, however, overwhelmingly dominate the definitive sets released in 1908 and 1938. On the former, 10 of the 11 stamps offered the same image of Washington, while in the 1938 Prex's series, 29 of the 32 stamps presented busts of presidents. The 1975 Americana series marked a clear end to this tradition, being the first U.S. definitive issue on which no presidential portrait appeared, and presidents played only a minor role in the subsequent Great American series. As of 2016, every U.S. president who is deceased has appeared on at least one U.S. postage stamp, and all but Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford have appeared on at least two. First appearances. The portrayals of various American presidents made the first appearances on U.S. postage at different times for very different reasons. Among the most definitive is George Washington, whose engraving appeared on the first U.S. postage stamps released by the U.S. Post Office on July 1 of 1847. Thomas Jefferson first appeared on U.S. postage in March 1856, 9 years after the first issues were released. 15 years of stamp issuance would pass before Andrew Jackson would appear on a U.S. postage stamp. However, by this time, Jackson had already been presented on 2 Confederate stamps, making him the only U.S. president introduced to postage by the Confederacy rather than the U.S. Post Office. Abraham Lincoln appeared for the first time on a U.S. postage stamp with the issue of 1866, released on April 14, 1866, the first anniversary of his death. Up until this time only the portrayals of Washington, Franklin, Jefferson and Jackson were found on U.S. postage. The first Washington postage stamp, the 5-cent Franklin and the 10-cent Washington postage stamps issued in 1847 were the first postage stamps issued and authorized for nationwide postal duty by the U.S. Post Office. The firm of Rawdon, Wright, Hatch, and Edson of New York City were given a 4-year contract to print the first U.S. postage stamps in 1847. The initials RWH and AMP-E are clearly engraved at the bottom of both stamps. The engraving of Washington is identical to the one by the portrait engraver Asher Brown Durand on a banknote issued by Fairfield County Bank of Connecticut, during a period when many banks issued their own forms of paper currency. Both the Washington and Franklin issues were reprinted in 1875 from re-engraved images subtly different from the originals. In March 1856, the Post Office issued the first postage stamp to feature Thomas Jefferson. The exact date of issue is not clear. Scott's specialized catalog of United States stamps and covers establishes the release date with the first known use of this issue, March 24, 1856. The first issue of the stamp was in imperforate form, engraved and printed by Topham, Carpenter, Cassilier and Amp Co. The Jefferson issue saw postal duty from the spring of 1856 to the summer of 1857. The engraving of Jefferson was modeled after a portrait of the president by Gilbert Stewart. By mid-1857 the stamps were issued with the top and bottom design projections omitted and with perforations. This printing was issued in at least 6 major color variations. On July 1, 1863, the Post Office issued the 2-cent Jackson stamp, commonly referred to by collectors as the Blackjack stamp, printed by the National Bank Note Company. It was released on the same day the new drop letter rate was raised to 2 cents. Jackson is the third U.S. president to be honored on U.S. postage. On or near April 14, 1866, 1 year after Lincoln's assassination in 1865, the U.S. Post Office issued its first postage stamp honoring the fallen president. The engraving of Lincoln was rendered by Joseph Auden after a photograph by C.S. German.